Greetings. In one of my recent videos titled Human Dignity, I expressed my admiration with Article 1 of the German Constitution, which states human dignity is inviolable. To respect and protect it is the duty of all state authority. A few of you, rightfully so, felt the need in the comments to inform us all that this article that I was so admiring was written after World War II. That this was a nation forced to look at itself and the atrocities it had committed. I see and feel that in those words written there. You see, that is exactly why I have such admiration for the basic right of human dignity here in Germany. That is why I, as an American in Germany, personally find it a beautiful thing to see that thought process and those words. Humans make mistakes, but a true sign of progress, intelligence, empathy is when a human has the courage to face and admit their mistake. And then, as the Germans did, for example, do everything in their power to make sure it never happens again. One of my favorite sayings is by a philosopher named George Santayana. And he said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Boy, I feel like we're seeing proof of that right now in America. And just as Germany did, just as Germany sat down, looked at the horrific atrocities it had committed against mankind, it called itself out, it admitted its faults, and it loudly declared to the rest of the world, we will not let this happen again. And we will have reminders everywhere to make sure nobody forgets, and so that this doesn't happen again. I wish the nation I was born into would do this. Am I going too far to say, if we look at history, it might be time for America to look at some of their paperwork and who wrote it? And if the people who wrote it, if their values still represent the values of the common man today? Sure, my American school that I attended touched on slavery and touched on a bit of what was done to the Native Americans, but if I'm completely honest with you, I feel like they've whitewashed, let's say, over a lot of fine details. And what you are seeing on the news happening in America today is not a new thing. This is not new. This comes from decades of this. Those who cannot remember their past are condemned to repeat it. It's documented that in 1763, the new Americans, basically looting this land, a Captain Simeon Ecuyer, 22-year-old white European in this newfound land, boasted in his journal about using biological warfare against the native folks of that land. He wrote, "We gave them 2 blankets and a handkerchief from a smallpox clinic." He added, "I hope it will have the desired effect." But did you know in 1790, the Naturalization Act of 1790 was put into place, which stated, citizenship is restricted to free whites. And what about in 1819, when Congress passes the so-called Civilization Act to assimilate Native Americans? This law provided funds from the U.S. government to missionaries, basically so they could get rid of the natives' culture with Christianity. By 1830, Congress enacted the Indian Removal Act, which legalized the removal of all Indians east of the Mississippi. In 1845, the white man's looting continues and they annex Texas. And in 1846, the U.S. declares war on Mexico. 1855, in this looted land, made up of people now from a bunch of different countries. And in 1855, California requires all instruction be conducted in English. And in 1857, the Supreme Court made a decision to deny all possibilities of citizenship for African Americans in Dred Scott versus Sanford. 1862, President Lincoln signed something called the Homestead Act, in which he allotted land, 160 acres or so, that was Native American land. He decided to sell it to anyone who could, well, anyone being white European settlers, who could cultivate it in 5 years. And he sold it to them at a cheap price. And in this cheap land buying scheme to have it cultivated, the Homestead Act, it would seem, only applied to U.S. citizens. Native Americans, black people, non-European immigrants were all excluded. In 1860 to 1861, though, 11 pro-slavery states seceded from the Union and formed the Confederacy, triggering the Civil War. 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation formally declared slaves free. But let's not forget, in 1864, Congress makes it illegal for Native Americans to be taught their native language in schools and sends those children to boarding schools. Also, in 1864, with the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution abolishing slavery, the U.S. Army massacres around 300 Cheyenne Indian in the Sand Creek Massacre. In 1866, the Ku Klux Klan is founded to maintain white supremacy through intimidation and violence. In 1870, the Naturalization Act of 1790 and the 14th Amendment, so that naturalization is limited to white people and people of African descent, but effectively excluding now Chinese and other Asian immigrants from naturalization. In 1871, a white mob in Los Angeles attacks a Chinese community, killing 19 and destroying the community. Around the same time, Congress passes the Indian Appropriations Act, dissolving the status of Indian tribes as nations. And in 1878, U.S. Supreme Court rules Chinese individuals are ineligible for naturalized citizenship. All through this time, you got Jim Crow laws coming into place and lynchings happening. 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson upholds a doctrine of separate but equal among blacks and whites in public facilities. The annihilation, land stealing, flat-out genocide against people of color continues. Even in 1900, as 14 million immigrants arrive between 1900 and 1920. And the Chinese Exclusion Act just keeps getting extended. In 1909, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, is created. In 1910, Angel Island opens, billed as the Ellis Island of the West, but used primarily as a detention center to control the flow of Asian immigrants, primarily Chinese, into the U.S. 1914, U.S. invades Mexico again, and in 1917, whites attack African Americans in race riots in East St. Louis, Illinois. And we've got more immigration acts forbidding people of Asian descent. 1918, Texas makes it a criminal offense to use any language but English in the schools. 1919, the U.S. Department of Justice rounds up and deports aliens from Southern European and Latin American backgrounds during the Palmer raids. Thousands are arrested and many immigrant activists are deported. It should be noted around this time that the Ku Klux Klan was in its heyday. 1920, women are granted the right to vote, but not all women. Through 1921 to 1930, thousands of Mexican workers, including U.S. citizens, were deported. Sound familiar? Look at 1921, the Emergency Quota Act, which favors immigration from Europe. Sound familiar? What about 1922, the Cable Act? Declares any female U.S. citizen who marries an alien that is ineligible to citizenship will lose her citizenship. 1923, the Supreme Court rules that Asians are not white and therefore ineligible for citizenship. It should be noted that in 1924, the Ku Klux Klan was influential in the passage of the National Origins Act, making racism part of the official U.S. immigration policy until 1965. Around this time, the U.S. Border Patrol was created, introducing a distinction between legal and illegal immigrants for the first time. 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt launches the New Deal. Most African Americans, of course, though, are excluded from benefits as domestic workers, railway porters, and agricultural workers are excluded. 1940, the Alien Registration Act, the Smith Act, requires registration and fingerprinting of immigrants over age 14. And this coincides with FBI information gathering on enemy aliens, primarily targeting Japanese Americans, and not those of German or Italian descent. And in 1942, President Roosevelt authorizes the internment of over 100,000 Japanese Americans living in California, including citizens. Sound familiar? Filipinos, however, now are reclassified as U.S. citizens, conveniently making it possible for them to register in the military. I'm just going to fast forward because it's just too much, America. It's too much. To 1955, Miss Rosa Parks. She refuses to surrender her seat when ordered by a local bus driver in Montgomery, Alabama. And by 1961, the Native American population has grown to 800,000. Half are on reservations. 500 tribal and urban Native American leaders meet in Chicago to form the National Indian Youth Council. Freedom rides across the South at the same time begin to challenge against segregation in interstate travel facilities. More than 1,000 volunteers, black and white, participate. In 1962, James Meredith is the first black student to enter the University of Mississippi. He does this under federal guard as President Kennedy had to send 5,000 troops. 5,000 troops to quell the white violence. In 1963, Martin Luther King is jailed during anti-segregation protests. From that jail, he wrote a letter in which he argued that individuals have a moral duty to disobey unjust laws. A Baptist church in Birmingham is bombed, killing 4 children. In 1964, there is a massive effort to register African American voters. In Freedom Summer, the Civil Rights Act passes. In Mississippi, the Ku Klux Klan murders registered and working black voters. President Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act of 1964, outlawing discrimination in jobs and public accommodations. 1965, civil rights workers marching for voting rights are stopped on Pettus Bridge by police officers who used tear gas, clubs, and whips against them. This day will then be dubbed Bloody Sunday. Around 1868, the Supreme Court finally banned the banning of interracial marriages and forced the 16 states that were still staying strong and wanted to have interracial marriage as illegal, forced them to make it legal. However, it should be clear at this time, in this battle for civil rights, there's quite a bit of unrest in African American neighborhoods. All is not right. It's too much. Let's fast forward to 1970. Wounded Knee. Some 300 Lakota Sioux occupy the town of Wounded Knee on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota to demand Native American rights. Many are members of the so-called American Indian Movement. 200 FBI agents, federal marshals, and Bureau of Indian Affairs surround the town, armed with machine guns and grenades. Native Americans are fired at on the ground from a helicopter to die. After 71 days, the siege ends in a negotiated settlement. 1974, the Supreme Court decision, Milden versus Bradley, rules that schools may not be desegregated across school districts. This allows for legal segregation of students of color in inner city districts from white students in suburban districts. In 1980, the Refugee Act passes, wherein a system is developed to handle refugees fleeing persecution as a class separate from other immigrants. This is a good thing. You know why? Because in 1980 to 1989, the U.S. military interventions in El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Grenada, Lebanon, Libya, Iran, and Panama contribute to new streams of immigration in the United States. That's between 1980 and 1989, yeah. Fast forward to 1990, the U.S.-Mexico border is now militarized. INS and private citizens commit increasing acts of violence against migrants crossing the border and migrant workers in the United States. 1991, African-American Rodney King is beaten and arrested in Los Angeles by police officers. In the beginning age of cell phones, it makes its rounds around the world. Quite a few Americans know that this was not a new thing. By 1992, those police officers who beat up Rodney King, they were acquitted. Riots ensued. Sound familiar? In 1995, the Oklahoma City bombing, a U.S. white supremacist, kills more than 150 people. Around 1996, America has welfare reform. It establishes time limits for public assistance for the poor with disproportionately negative effects on women of color. African American church burnings sweep the South and the nation around this time. Also at this time, there's acts put into place that make undocumented immigrants ineligible for pretty much any help. Congress also votes to double Border Patrol to around 10,000 agents. After the attacks on September 11th, the U.S. administration declares its war on terror. More than 1,200 Arab, Muslim, and South Asian men are detained in secret. The U.S. Patriot Act gives the American government greater powers to detain suspected terrorists, eavesdrop on communications, and counter money laundering. The Department of Homeland Security is created. 2002. 2002 to 2003, the United States conducts special registration, where boys and men in the United States from 25 Muslim-majority countries must register and be fingerprinted in the search for terrorists. Some 1,300 men are placed in deportation proceedings for minor immigration infractions. 2010, rising racism, vitriol, threats of violence surround the debate for healthcare legislation. The Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, which a lot of people call Obamacare, is signed into law. If fully implemented at this time, it will extend healthcare coverage to roughly half of the 50 million uninsured individuals, many poor, many people of color, across the nation by 2016, roughly half. In 2011, a record number of individuals, 2 million migrants, are deported from the United States between 2008 and 2012. 2011, Trayvon Martin is killed. 17-year-old African-American boy killed by a piece of trash called George Zimmerman, fancied himself the neighborhood watch. This case brought once again to the forefront something that again is nothing new. This case highlighted how racial profiling disproportionately targets African American men because of inherent unconscious bias that persistently endanger their lives. And in 2013, that George Zimmerman was acquitted, which of course once again ignited protests around the country. Because again, it's nothing new. But in 2012, the U.S. government's use of drone warfare is increasing around the world. Pakistan, Afghanistan, Yemen, crossing into new frontier. Thousands are killed, Many more suffer injury, destruction of their homes, communities, and livelihoods, all as a result of drone warfare. With the 2013 acquittal of George Zimmerman's flat-out murder of Trayvon Martin, the Black Lives Matter movement launches by mobilizing millions of protesters after the killing of Trayvon Martin. It's becoming clear to a lot of people at this point that there seem to be a lot of people in power that don't think Black Lives Matter. And so until they do, we're going to remind them. 2014, Eric Garner, choked out by a cop, all caught on film. There was no police accountability. That led to protests, of course. About Michael Brown, 18 years old, fatally shot by police, Ferguson, Missouri. Non-indictment of that police officer. What do you think it brought? Protests. Nothing new. This is all nothing new. 2014, the United States reopens family detention centers in Texas and Pennsylvania. The detention center facilities hold mainly refugee women and children seeking refuge from violence and extreme poverty in South America. Detention centers. Family detention centers. Once again, 2015, following the death of Freddie Gray, we've got riots in the streets because once again, the protests are part of a growing movement for Black lives that focuses not only on ending police brutality, but addressing the underlying causes of systematic racism. Should also be mentioned that in 2015, a 21-year-old named Dylan Roof killed 9 people inside of a church. And I'm pretty sure the cops brought in burgers afterwards. Dylan said that massacre was because he wanted to spark a race war. They bought him cheeseburgers, fast food of some type. Around 2016, we found out that the drinking water in Flint was unfit to drink. Locals were misled by state and local officials, with African American children suffering from lead poisoning at 3 times the rate as white children. Flint is a stark example of the rampant nature of environmental racism. Somewhere around 2017, this so-called President Trump attempted to sign 2 executive orders banning entry for people from 7 Muslim countries. The order also seeked to dismantle the entire refugee program. They don't want to take refugees anymore. Don't seem to have a problem with making refugees. They don't want to take them. Luckily, federal judges halted these Muslim bans on the grounds that they were unconstitutional, but the current administration is constantly trying to find its way to get away with basically what I can only call white supremacist motivations. Fast forward May 25th, 2020. George Floyd is murdered in broad daylight on film with several officers present doing nothing to stop it, as Officer Derek Chauvin basically crushed his neck in the streets. And once again, protests have begun. The people have risen into the street, as they should, because none of this is anything new. For the sake of saving time, I left out a lot. There is a lot more to add on to everything I already listed out. So for those of you who wondered why I made that video on human dignity, or wondered why I was so enamored with this basic law here in Germany, now you know. Those moments that the German people took to humbly reflect upon atrocities they committed and vow openly before the world to never repeat them again. That is such a powerful and beautiful thing. I wish it was something that would happen in America. I'm just saying, as I said in the beginning, it might be time to look at your paperwork, America. Who wrote it? What were their values? And do their values represent the common man? And if history keeps repeating itself, why is that? I don't have all the answers, and I tend to make myself crazy with facts. But I really do like that saying that if you're not aware of your past, you're doomed to repeat it. And I think America is a really good example of that right now. Much power and love to the people in the streets. From me to you. The people need change. Change is hardest at the beginning, messiest in the middle, and best at the end. Until we meet again, my lovely viewers, take care of yourself.